I'll say one word and thanking you again. So thank you again for joining us online. Hopefully the link on the email was correct. I mean, I checked that it's the same that we used today. Sometimes that's tricky. It's like looking for rooms around UCL. Like luckily you're whole year. So thank you so much for joining us today, Ambrogio. Like in a way it's welcome back, in the sense you told me that you studied engineering. So we are now in a faculty of engineering, not specifically this building, but yeah, the computer science department is in the faculty of engineering. And as we're saying, in this financial computing analytics series, we try to use methodology ranging from econometrics to mathematical finance, statistical physics, definitely network theory, machine learning, and try to use methodologies that have been applied maybe in social science and apply them in economics, or the other way around. So it's quite an interdisciplinary group. And also in this room, I see a lot of interdisciplinary faces. And so thanks a lot for joining us today. And so we'll have time for presentation, then some time for questions, and then hopefully some pizza. I always say that also for people on Zoom so that they know for next time. And thanks again. The floor is yours.
Amazing. So thanks a lot for having me. It's exciting to be talking to an audience that is not the usual one. And maybe I have two disclaimers to make. The first disclaimer is, especially since we're recording this, these are only my views and not those of the Bank of England committees. And the second disclaimer is I'm unsure about or not fully aware of what the backgrounds of people in the room is, what the shared language or shared models is. So whenever we get lost in translation, please stop me. Actually, I have a third disclaimer to make. This presentation is for like one and a half hours maybe. So I have less time than I thought I had. And I think I'm going to focus on the empirical parts. But if you think I should focus on the more structural ESG general equilibrium model, you tell me now, we'll be silent forever. Okay, good. Good, I'll focus on the first bit then, which should cover at least half an hour, and then we can stop at there. But please do stop me as I go along, because I'm very happy to take any questions you might have. All right, given all these disclaimers, this work is joined with Andrea Ferrero, who's at Oxford, and is about the transmission of Keynesian supply shocks. So the first thing I want to do is to tell you what Keynesian supply shocks are. And the way in which I'm going to try and do that, clicker is going to help me. Yes. Is by means of a simple example of an economy that is composed by two different sectors, cinemas and popcorn. And what I want you to think about is a shock to the supply of goods in one of these sectors only. So it's a sector-specific supply shock. That's in the spirit a little bit of what happened during the COVID period, the very beginning of the pandemic, is a productivity shock that affects the cinema sector only. So the idea is I can operate my cinema only half capacity. Is this like a productivity shock that reduces the output I can produce or sell in this case, and which is going to lead to an increase in the price of cinema tickets. Okay, so that's the standard effect that it would have in an economy if you had a productivity shock. The difference is that we're considering a shock that affects only a subset of the economy or a part of the economy. And the interesting question that we want to ask is what happens to the other sector? What happens to the price and the output of the popcorn sector? And kind of intuitively, and I'm going to be a bit loose here, but you can formalize what I'm going to say now. The answer to this question crucially depends on what you assume on the substitutability between these two goods. So if you live in a world where I'm happy to substitute away from cinemas and binge on popcorn because I'm just happy with that, then what's going to happen is that because of the price increase in cinemas, in tickets, I'm going to switch to popcorn. I'm going to create excess demand for these goods where nothing happens to the productivity of this sector. I'm going to create excess demand for this good, which creates an increase in the prices. Okay. This is like a standard effect where in both sectors you would have that prices are going to increase. Now, if you instead assume that I only enjoy popcorn when I'm at the cinema, if I observe this big increase in the price of cinema tickets, I'm going to reduce my demand for popcorn because I really don't enjoy popcorn at home. I'm not going to substitute away anymore. I'm going to decrease my demand for popcorn, which is going to engineer a fall in the price of this good as well. A fall in the price of these goods. And you can already see that depending on how strong this complementarity effect is, you can engineer a situation where something that originated as a sectoral supply shock is going to lead to an aggregate effect. By aggregate effect, I mean looking at the aggregate economy, is going to look like something that resembles an aggregate demand shock. Okay, where here I'm for an aggregate demand shock, I have in mind something that moves output and quantities in the same direction. Okay, so what I'm trying to kind of, the example I'm trying to make here with this slide is if you were a macroeconometrician like myself that looks at aggregate data only, and you would try to extract what's the source of what originated the business cycle fluctuation that are observed in output and prices, I would completely mislabel the origin of the shock, and I would call it an aggregate demand shock, while effectively this could have been driven by a sectoral supply shock. And this is clearly important because, I'm going to get to this maybe later on, but the way in which you can respond to such a shock in terms of stabilization policies that you may want to do can differ quite dramatically depending on whether the source of the shock was aggregate demand, a fall in aggregate demand in this case, or a negative volatility shock in the sector. Okay, are you on board with this?
You just asked a quick question related to the example. So, not strictly related to cinemas, but excess demand for cinemas, price increases. But then, so for substitutability, there is an excess demand for popcorn if you can switch and watch movies at home. But the negative supply shock means that there are less cinemas available, right?
Right.
So the absolute demand of people watching movies is the same. So why should you have an excess demand for popcorn?
Because the supply is falling. So imagine that all of us demand a cinema ticket every day, and the cinema has as many of us seats. But tomorrow the cinema has only half of the seats available. We still all want to go to the cinema. There is an excess demand for cinema tickets because there's 20 of us in this room, right?
For cinemas, it's clear. For popcorns?
For popcorns, in principle, popcorn is not affected by the shock, right?
Yeah.
And so it really depends on your kind of optimal behavior in response to something that happens here, which leads to a price increase. Okay. And if you consume a bundle of these goods, okay, I'm assuming in the background, I'm assuming that our consumption bundle is a combination of cinemas and popcorn. Okay. Now I can consume less cinemas, and the price of these cinemas has gone up a lot. So then, depending on whether I'm happy to switch away from, my £100 in my pockets are still the same.
Okay? I'm substituting cinema for popcorn, basically.
If you are substituting cinemas for popcorn, then I had £100 in my pockets. I say, oh, this is actually very expensive. I'm going to spend all my £100 on popcorn, and I'm going to create excess demand trades. If instead I have complementarity and I just stay at home and park my money under the carpet and I leave them there, and so there is going to be even less than usual demand for popcorn because I'm actually not spending any of my £100 into popcorn. That's the idea.
So substitutability refers between cinemas and popcorn.
Yeah. So maybe what I kind of was assuming here is that there is my consumption. My consumption is a bundle, is like a CES aggregator, some kind of weighted average of cinemas and popcorn only, because this economy is just composed by these two goods.
Sure.
The idea is that if you watch movies at home, you have more money in your pocket because you don't have to spend the ticket for the cinema, and as you have nothing else to spend it with, you spend it on popcorns.
Okay. You had a question.
Just a doubt for the later. Don't need to spoil. And then afterwards, you using this assumption that demand increase demand corresponding to this price.
That's what I'm saying.
Empirically not true.
Depending on what you are.
Because, I mean, depends. In the short term, sometime happens. In the long term, you increase production, production becomes cheaper, prices go down. And so
this is a paper about business cycle fluctuations, so it's not a paper about the long run. And so all I'm doing here, I'm kind of departing from a standard single goods economy, which is the benchmark economy that forms the basis for models that we use for policymaking, for example, and entertaining the possibility that there are multiple sectors hit by idiosyncratic shocks. We tend to think of idiosyncratic shocks as being uncorrelated, being asymptotically small or to vanish asymptotically if the sectors you're considering are many or small enough. And so the reason is, the reason why we consider aggregate models is exactly because these things don't tend to matter in the aggregate. Okay? And consider this departure, it's just a simple example showing you that if you have a multiple sector economy, you can actually have aggregate consequences as soon as you entertain the possibility that you have some complementarity between two goods. Now, don't focus too much on this example, it's just to give you an intuition for why complementarity matters. These type of complementarities can arise in many forms, and the ones that possibly are going to be way more important than this example on consumption goods is going to be through production networks using intermediate inputs. Think of me as being a firm that produces stuff with all of your goods, and you guys use all of and we all use our own inputs. Then you have a full production network with an input-output matrix. And as long as you allow for complementarity in my inputs that I all get from you, then the price increase in the input you produce is going to reduce my demand for all of your inputs exactly for the same intuition. Okay, so it's a general statement I'm making about complementarity stability, which is typically ignored in macroeconomic models where you just move away from sectoral dynamics and you just consider the aggregate.
So there are only two sectors or two users can spend your money on, but can keep it in the bank. So when you apply with the complementarity situation, not spend the.
But that's exactly is going to use the efficient demand for popcorn, right?
But also with substitutability, you could watch the movies from home and you decided to eat as much popcorn as before. So you should actually have a situation where it grows, the demand for popcorn stays the same, or it goes down. Or would the situation where it remains the same be within substitutability?
You can have infinite amounts of situations, of course.
Yes.
And infinite linear combinations that give infinite amounts of possibilities. All I'm trying to argue here is that the way in which you think about aggregate demand shocks, like monetary policy shocks, for example, it's a monetary policy shock that increases interest rates is going to induce you to consume less and save more. And in principle, you're going to consume less of all the goods in the economy, even if you have complementarity. Okay? That type of shock is a shock that moves aggregate output and aggregate prices in the same direction. And there is very strong evidence of that. Okay, in the short term. Okay, forget about the long term. So people tend to use those movements in the aggregate to try and tease out from the data what are the sources of business cycle fluctuations, imposing this movement at the aggregate level. What I wanted to do with this slide is to give you a possibility whereby this type of movement arises from a very different source of variation, which is not a demand shock, is not an aggregate shock, is actually a supply shock that originates in a single sector. That's what I want to convey with the slides. Okay? Good. And the reason why we call this Keynesian supply shocks is because of some guys who worked on kind of who came up with the term of Keynesian supply shocks. It's a quite influential paper by Guerrieri, Lorenzo, and Starr and Verlin, people from Northwestern, MIT, and where else? And Harvard, who basically developed in much more detail the theory behind this notion and the theory behind this kind of simple example I did. Okay, and they just the complementarity is the key necessary condition you need, but then there are a bunch of additional ingredients that are important to generate this type of, or to amplify this type of mechanism very much. So now the question of what we want to do in this paper is whether the data support this notion of Keynesian supply shocks and this transmission mechanism that I just outlined. Okay. And we want to, if so, we want to be able to offer some evidence about this transmission mechanism. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to focus on the first part of the paper, which is empirical, which is going to use a multi-sector factor augmented VAR. It's a vector autoregression. I've been told we probably speak a very similar language when it comes to this model. And it's almost obvious why you want to use this thing, because I want to account for many sectors. That's why the multi-sector. I want to allow the possibility of the existence of sectoral shocks, but aggregate shocks. So I need some kind of common factors which are going to capture the aggregate effects of aggregate shocks, like monetary policy, for example, which is not sectoral. And I'm going to use this model in a way that's is going to allow to speak to this question. And we find that the data are indeed consistent with this Keynesian supply view. And crucially, we think that the reason why we think this paper is quite cool, actually, and interesting, is that we remove COVID, which I used to motivate this first line, from all of our estimation sums. Okay, we want to ask whether in more normal business cycle fluctuations, we do see evidence for this mechanism. So COVID was an obvious example where we had a sectoral shock. I just want to ask, are business cycles driven by sectoral shocks in normal times? Okay. And this is kind of important because, as I just told you in the beginning, most of the models we use for policy making are based on the idea that sectoral tails or firm level dynamics in the aggregate wash out, because they tend to be uncorrelated. And if you take an average and you take the limit of this average for n equals to infinity, things vanish. So that's why we tend to think of business cycles as being driven by aggregate shocks like oil shocks, which are clearly affecting all sectors and come from abroad, if you're not a more producing economy, monetary policy shocks, and then there is this notion of aggregate demand shocks that we kind of cannot characterize very well. People use as a way to model these aggregate demand shocks. We call it impatience shocks. They just came up in a way to say, oh, suddenly we wake up and we're all more impatient. If you plug this notion in a model where a shock is some factor agents, then you have this positive movement I was talking about.
Yeah, no, just to understand the vocabulary. So when you talk about business cycle, we are talking really worldwide, nationwide business cycles.
Nationwide open cycles.
Big stuff.
Which is what eventually the Bank of England is looking at when coming up with policy recommendations. You know, you care about what's happening to deviations of GDP from its efficient level or trend level, and the same for inflation. So I'm talking about variations in output growth and inflation at the economy-wide level. Okay. I just want to say, oh yes. Now, here's maybe where the kind of language thing. So if you take why I'm so obsessed with this positive movements of output and inflation and these aggregate demand shocks, because if you take a simple correlation of output growth and inflation in the data, the positive correlation is stunningly high. Okay, so you are saying it's not obvious that demand shocks, yet, in the data, unconditionally, if I take a simple correlation, I observe a very, very strong correlation between output, inflation, hours, investment, and so on. Okay, so there must be some structural force that generates this positive movement in the data and that dominates over all the other structural shocks, like I mentioned, oil shocks. Oil shocks tend to lead to negative movement between output and prices. If you have in mind what happened in the last couple of years, inflation is high, output is low. So what is that is driving this kind of positive movement in the aggregate data? And that's why people came up with this notion of aggregate demand shocks, like discount factor shocks, or other stories that are a measure of our ignorance to some extent. Well, here we're providing some interpretation of this positive movement we observe in the data through the lens of a shock that is much easier to kind of, at least in our view, to think of than an impatience shock, where I wake up every morning and just want to binge on all the goods in the economy. Okay, so that's kind of the background. Now I'm going to give you an intuition for what we do empirically. If you get this if you get the slide, then the rest is formalizing this notion, basically. So I just argued that Keynesian supply shocks and aggregate demand shocks imply the same restrictions on aggregate data. They lead to the same movement. And so if I want to extract them only using aggregate data, I'm going to have a hard time on it because they move aggregate output and prices in the same direction. However, and the key to understand what we do here is that they imply different restrictions on sectoral data, as we just see, right? So let me entertain the possibility that these impatience shocks exist, and they're actually the unique driver of movements in output and inflation. Then what I should see is that output and prices move in the same direction in all the sectors of the economy. Maybe heterogeneously, right? Because sectors are different, they're different size in how prices are sticky, in how they respond to shocks and so on. But still, I should observe the positive movement between output and prices. So maybe one sector you have a little increase in prices and a massive increase in outputs. Maybe in another sector you have the opposite, but still you should have positive movement between these two variables.
Output is production.
Output is production in this case. Yes, think of it as sectoral GDP, really. If instead we entertain the possibility that at least some of the movement, not all of it, I don't want to argue that these guys are driving all of the movement we observe in the data, but just if we entertain the possibility that some of the movements that we observe unconditionally, by unconditional I mean taking these two series and taking correlation, that's it, is driven by these Keynesian supply shocks, then I should see that at least in some sectors, output and prices should move in different directions. This was our initial example. Aggregate output and prices move in the aggregates. They move in the popcorn sector, and they move negatively in the cinema sector. Okay? And that's this kind of exactly the intuition we're gonna use to try and tease out whether these guys exist in the data or not. Okay. And in practice, and then I'm going to spend basically the rest, maybe 20 minutes formalizing this notion. What I'm going to do, I'm going to proceed in two steps. Okay. This is a bit of an indirect way to show the point that I want to show. That these guys play some role in explaining business cycles. It's indirect because I'm going to start from the aggregate data. So I'm going to fool myself somehow. We just agreed that starting from aggregate data is completely useless, right? Because there's no way I can separate the two. But that's exactly my purpose. So I'm going to start from aggregate data and extract a shock that moves output and prices in the same direction. Which means that if these guys exist, they will end up being inside this object here. And then I'm going to go to the sectoral data and ask, out of these objects that I extracted, that until yesterday, I would have thought it was only the aggregate demand shock, can I show that some sectors respond with negative movements to this object that I just identified? And if that's the case, then I can arguably convince you that some of these Keynesian supply shocks play at least some role. I wouldn't be able to say how much. I wouldn't be able to say how important they are. I wouldn't be able to say which sectors are those who generate this movement, but I will be able to say that they do exist, which is everything we want to do in this paper. And once we know that they exist, then basically we have a bit of an agenda on this topic. We are trying now to kind of identify those shocks that lead to this type of because now we have a better sense of which sectors can generate this transmission and so on. Is this clear? Right. Let me skip this in the interest of time. So let me just implement what this intuition in an econometric model. So I'm going to start from an embarrassingly simple autoregressive model for the dynamics at the sectoral level for output and inflation. Again, think of this as GDP and inflation at the sectoral level. Okay. I denotes a sector, T denotes quarter. I have just a simple reduced form VAR, vector autoregression for this sector. And in this vector, I have output and inflation. We kind of already argued that to account properly for sectoral dynamics, you need some form of aggregate shocks, because we do believe that these aggregate shocks exist, say monetary policy or oil price shocks. And so I'm going to assume a factor structure for these residuals, eta it, and I'm just going to say that depend on a vector of unobserved common components on which each sector can load heterogeneously with a sector-specific loading, and then some truly idiosyncratic noise. Okay. Now, I'm going to use a statistical model to extract and identify these factors. But before doing that, maybe this is something, maybe this is obvious to you, but I just want to do a remark, which is whatever methodology I'm going to use, statistical methodology I'm going to use to extract these guys from the data, these common factors are going to capture two things. The first thing is truly aggregate shocks. So if there is a monetary policy shock in the data that affects all sectors, maybe heterogeneously, it's going to be in this guy here. But if there are these Keynesian supply shocks I was talking about, they will also end up being in this vector T. And why is that the case? Because if you allow a sectoral shock to have aggregate effects, my statistical model will have no chance to separate these two. The model will think that this sectoral shock that propagates through the production network and affects everyone, exactly as if it was an aggregate shock. Okay, does it make sense? So all of this to say that, what I'm going to care about is these objects. These sectoral innovations, I'm going to ignore. They're not interesting for what I want to do. The main object I'm going to be focusing on is FT, vector FT, and the loadings. And the way in which I'm going to recover these unobserved factors is by aggregation. So this is kind of, you can think of, there are many methodologies available to actually recover, to estimate or identify factors in a model like this one. Probably, the most obvious one would be principal components, but there are factor models of very different kinds, which I'm sure you're familiar with. What we're going to do is to use a different approach that shares many of these features with many of the features of factor models. Especially, we're going to recover FT by aggregation, which means that we're going to extract the factors with cross-sectional weighted averages of the data, which is maybe in this crowd I don't need to, economists are maybe a bit more averse to this idea. And
hi, Ambrogio.
Let me just spend 5 minutes explaining exactly what I do. I mean, it's trivial, but we're going to consider a set of weights that are fixed for each sector. I can allow them to be time varying, and we have these robustness exercises. These are the true weights. These are fixed, meaning I can get them from the data. Let's say the legal services sector, if accounts for 2% of our aggregate outputs, then it's going to be a 2%, a 0.02 number here. I'm going to denote weighted averages with a bar. So then X bar T is going to be the weighted average of all the output growth and all the inflations in my economy. And I'm going to do an assumption that is exactly the same that underpins principal components and factor models, which is the cross-sectional weighted average of the idiosyncratic residuals used is asymptotically disappearing when I take under certain conditions on the weights, and if n is large enough, okay, which is very standard. And this is the main assumption kind of we need on top of some regularity conditions on these weights here. Then under that assumption, I'm going to do like 4 steps. I'm going to get my factors. Again, quite trivially. The first thing I can do is to write recursively my VAR as a sum of infinite shocks, both the aggregate shocks with the loadings and the idiosyncratic residuals. Then I can take weighted averages of the right-hand side and on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So I have observables on the left-hand side and a bunch of weighted averages of shocks, infinite sum of shocks on the right-hand side. And under our weak correlation assumption, plus the regularity conditions that I mentioned on the weights, plus you want this process to be non-explosive, basically, you can, we just kind of, I just gave you intuition for why this guy basically disappears, which is trivial if you have n large enough, and in our case it's going to be 64, so it's not too bad. And once you get to this expression, now that you got rid of these guys, you can actually invert this infinite sum of terms, and express the factors as an infinite sum of observables, which you can truncate to approximate and to make this feasible. So basically, this should be an infinite sum of things, but you can show that if you choose a long enough number of legs, you're actually approximating your factors in a decent way. Okay, and so we're gonna, and there are tests, statistical tests to choose how many legs you want to use. So that's basically it. And these really, all I want to do with this slide is to motivate why I can use as a proxy for these unobserved factors here, a vector of cross-sectional weighted averages. Okay, so I move from an unobserved factor model to an observed model. And these guys are going to be weakly exogenous to the left-hand side variables here. So what I've done down here is to just substitute for the factors our truncated sum cross-sectional weighted averages, okay? And change the name of the coefficients, of course, because there are a bunch of multiplications. Now, you may wonder, why did you bother doing this? You could have done principal components and you would have gotten exactly the same intuition. The beauty of what we do is that instead of having a principal component here, we've got observables. And as you know, factors are identified only up to a rotation matrix. So I can just, rotate them as much as I want and obtain exactly the same thing. I'm going to explain exactly the same covariance. And since these are observables, I can actually rotate these things in a way that I can rotate them in an economically meaningful way. While factors, if you have no idea what they are, you can rotate them as much as you want, but you'll never convince me that one factor is aggregate GDP and the other factor is aggregate inflation. Okay? So what I'm going to do next is to take these guys, the X bars, and rotate them with an aggregate VAR. What I mean by rotating with an aggregate VAR, I can write this equation here. This would be, there is a reduced form residual here that would be a U, which is what you estimate. And then I can just choose a suitable rotation matrix that gives me orthogonal series of shocks, but then I can interpret in an economically meaningful way. So I don't know, maybe I'm going too quickly here. Are you familiar with some restrictions at all in VARs? Let me just, okay, forget about the economic intuition, just see the math. So basically I'm gonna do this thing and then plug this thing back into my factor model, which means that now the contemporaneous effect of the factors is captured by this guy here. Okay, I'm gonna tell you in a second how I get to this ease here. But I just want to, this is basically a factor model where I can obtain orthogonal series, okay, which I can interpret economically. And this is very different to what you would do with a standard dynamic factor model or with standard principal components, where you get orthogonal objects, but you have no idea what they are. Okay.
So there is a question in the chat from someone on Zoom.
Yes, hi, Ambrogio.
Can they speak up? And
yes, do you hear me?
It's probably easier. Oh, yes. No, can you speak now?
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I have a question regarding the specification of the VAR where you consider output and inflation. My question is, like, as you said, the model cannot capture the case shock, the Keynesian supply shock, because they have the same you have inflation, aggregate inflation, and so my question is, if you have sectoral prices in your specification, so for the case shock, so for one sector price might go up, so it can have positive sign, and for the other one it can have negative sign. So in that sense, like, you can capture from an aggregate demand, like aggregate demand will have plus plus, and then aggregate Keynesian supply shock will have plus minus. So, I mean, do you see it something reasonable, or?
I can get back to you later on why this approach would kind of fail. And that's the reason why we need to go this kind of the direction we're going now. But your intuition is kind of correct. You could try to impose signs. Mm-hmm. But you will soon see that you don't have enough independent restrictions to discipline the data, basically. And that's why, let me get to the next slide because I think it's going to speak to this. So basically, So let me just describe a bit, you know, more in detail what we do in this step, which I think is going to clarify things. So we use quarterly data at a sectoral level from the US. This kind of standard data, this is how the data looks like. These are the sectoral output growth equation series. And this is just to show you that once you aggregate these things, you get aggregate GDP. I mean, there is a tiny difference because, you know, the weighted average of the series is not exactly the growth rate of the aggregate, but whatever. Same for inflation, a lot of heterogeneity, and then you get the same pattern for, you know, if you aggregate, these are the comparison between our pi bar and the true pi bar you get from national accounts or from the statistical agency. So you should think of aggregate output, you should think of X bar as the aggregate data, okay? This speaks to your question. So here I'm using Y bar and pi bar, okay? In an aggregate VAR, so it's an embarrassingly simple model. It's a bivariate dynamic model which I estimate with OLS. And to recover, and my objective is to recover two orthogonal objects, okay, that I can label in an economically meaningful way. And what you can do is you kind of, you know, there is a covariance matrix here that you can decompose in infinite ways. You know, you devise a rotation matrix, an orthonormal rotation matrix, and you can get infinite amount of E's that are consistent with the covariant matrix of the U's. So you just keep on drawing from these random matrices. And then you classify these two orthogonal objects as demand-like shocks if they imply positive movements on the data. So if the first column of this B matrix is plus plus, and supply shocks if the second column of this B matrix is minus minus. Okay, and the way in which you run the way in which you estimate this model is by is a Bayesian VAR. So you know you get both parameter uncertainty around these estimated parameters as well as the uncertainty around the infinite rotation matrices that you can draw to get these sign restrictions. And in particular, we're going to use 5,000 draws for the rotation matrices and 5,000 draws, the same 5,000 draws also for the parameter uncertainty in the Bayesian VAR. So why do I call this a demand-like shock? Because I argued before that if Keynesian supply shocks exist, they're going to end up being here. And you know, I don't know if I fully understood the previous question, but if you impose these negative signs, there are many aggregate shocks, like oil shocks, I argued, or aggregate technology shocks that would lead to this co-movement here. Okay. So this is my way, if I implement this approach, this is my way to recover two orthogonal things here. One of these two orthogonal things is what I would have called an aggregate demand shock until yesterday, without this notion of Keynesian supply shocks. And what I want to claim is that actually this thing is kind of contaminated by the presence of these guys. And the way in which I'm going to show it to you is by going back to my factor model, and I'm going to estimate for each draw of my rotation matrix, for each sector from 1 to 64, I'm going to estimate this loading, lambda I, which captures how sectoral output and sectoral inflation respond to what I would have called an aggregate demand shock until yesterday. And so then almost, you know, we said this quite a few times now. If these loadings are positive for both output and inflation, then I can say, well, you know, we are in a world where demand shocks exist and they lead to aggregate demand positive movement here. But well, if I were to find that at least in some sectors, these loadings are positive for output and negative for inflation, then you know that would lend credibility to the other story, which is what I have here. So what I'm going to be doing now is to plot basically these loadings. So one is for output, one is for inflation. I'm going to pool loading across all sectors, 64 of them, and all of the 5,000 draws from these rotation matrices. And I'm going to normalize the output loadings to be negative. So think of this just a completely harmless normalization. I'm just saying that the shock has been negative. So it's a shock that decreases outputs. If the aggregate demand story is correct, I would expect all the inflation loadings to be negative. So this is how the output growth loadings look like. They're negative by construction. They're very heterogeneous, as you maybe would expect. You know, some sectors respond a lot, some sectors respond by little. But this is the key figure of the paper. So this is the distribution plot of the inflation load. And again, I argue that we should have not observed any loading in the positive part of this distribution chart if you had been in a world where demand shocks, truly demand shocks, are driving the data. And so we find that instead almost 40% of these loadings fall on the wrong part of the distribution, which is kind of not consistent with the story. And the way we think about it, I guess I mentioned this already, is that the VAR is kind of fooled by the presence of these Keynesian supply shocks, and these show up in this way in the data. Now you might say, well, you're pulling all this information and there's this kind of big spike around zero. Maybe this is just noise. Maybe these are just zero loadings. You know, I haven't shown you. It could be that this lambda, yes, is positive, but it's statistically insignificant and whatever. And you know, you're just identifying something that doesn't matter for anything. So to just show you that this is actually not the case, I'm zooming in here in two sectors, and I'm showing you the 5,000 loadings that I get for each sector with my rotation matrices. And I'm showing you here on the left a well-behaved sector where output and inflation fall in response to this aggregate demand shock. And a less well-behaved sector where there is not a single loading of the inflation distribution that falls under negative territory. Okay, so this sector really seems like behaving oddly relative to what you would expect if you entertain this aggregate demand view of the world. Okay. And I think I can kind of stop here. I mean, this is basically the main kind of message of the paper. We've done a bunch of robustness exercises that take into account a few of these concerns. And maybe let me just mention what we do in the model very quickly. So we take a production network model that really mimics the structure that we have in the data. And we can calibrate it very carefully with input-output data from the production network, with usages of input and so on. We simulate the data from the model, okay? And then we run our statistical approach on the simulated data. And then we simulate the data from the model, crucially, assuming that there is no aggregate shock whatsoever, okay? Not only there are no aggregate shocks whatsoever, so there is no monetary policy, there is no oil shock that affects the sector, there is no aggregate TFP shock, and so on. There are only sectoral productivity shocks that are uncorrelated among themselves. So I have a diagonal matrix 64 by 64 that drives productivity in these sectors randomly in all these sectors. Then I simulate data, I aggregate them into aggregate output and inflation. And I run my VAR with some restrictions, and I find that 50% of the variance of output is explained by my aggregate demand shock, which didn't even exist in the data generating process. Not only that, when I then go to the second step where I estimate the loadings, I get a picture that is very similar to the one that I got in my empirical evidence. While if I simulate the data conditional on truly aggregate demand shocks, those that I just described, the impatient shocks, of course, I'm going to explain all of the variation in output with these shocks, obviously. But crucially, I'm going to get only negative loadings here when I go to the second step. Okay, so that's just to give you a sense that it's kind of is an experiment in a more controlled laboratory that allows us to say, well, maybe you have another story in mind. Yes, maybe that story is still valid, but this kind of a more controlled experiment that lends credibility to our interpretation. So let me just stop here. Maybe I'm going to highlight that what we're doing now, as I mentioned before, is to try and think more about directly identifying these sectoral shocks rather than doing this very indirect, maybe a bit convoluted approach. But remember that our starting point is these things are weird. Economists don't tend to think that these sectoral shocks drive or have any role in driving business cycle fluctuations, aggregate ones. So can we just show some evidence that they do exist? Now that we're kind of convinced that they do exist, we want to ask, do they matter? And to answer that question, we need to actually pin them down. We need to find an example of a Keynesian supply shock that hits my sector and propagates in a way that leads to aggregate movement of prices and maybe explains, I don't know, 15% of the variance of output. So let me stop here. So I think I went a bit long, but yeah, thanks. And very happy to take